Hello everyone, my name is Tria Van Horn. I'm doing this PowerPoint on an article written by Sultan, Barakat, and Gareth Wardell called Exploited by Whom? An Alternative Perspective on Humanitarian Assistance to Afghan Women. So just to give you a little bit of background on Sultan Barakat, he is the founder of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, and he's really been the pioneer in doing these types of studies on the roles that conflict and humanitarian aid bring to different countries. He's currently a professor at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and has about 25 plus years of experience and also holds roles as a senior advisor for the United Nations, the World Bank, among other agencies. Gareth Wardell has 14 plus years in management positions for aid and development in Asia, specifically with Christian organizations giving different kinds of humanitarian aid. He was stationed in Kabul, Afghanistan from 1993 to 1996, which is right in the middle of the Afghanistan Civil War that we'll talk about later in this presentation, and he's currently an ordained minister. So to start off with, Barakat and Wardell really focused this article on the importance of listening to Afghan women and understanding their roles in their culture in order to be able to offer the best aid to them. And so some of the things that they try to do is break up these preconceived myths and notions that the Taliban is the ones that have put in all of these restriction on women, when a lot of times these are cultural practices and not something that's necessarily been enforced by the Taliban. So, for example, talking about the burqas, Barakat and Wardell say they are incredulous, talking about Western point of view, that what has been perceived as the arc symbol of the Taliban is worn even when the regime is long gone. So this is just talking about how even after the Taliban was fought off, there was still this presence of burqas among the Afghan women. Discrimination against Afghan women did not appear with the advent of the Taliban regime, and there is ample evidence to suggest that it is unlikely to end quickly now that the regime is gone. Again, this is just a statement that a lot of the things that we think as oppression of women in Afghan culture is not from the Taliban, but it's the culture that the Afghani people hold. And then I love this last quote. Many have claimed to speak for Afghan women, sometimes at the expense of listening to them. And this whole article just tries to explain the different viewpoints that a lot of women have so that we can better listen to them and listen to their background in order to be able to offer aid to them in the future. So listening to Afghan women's voices and being able to understand them really comes down to being able to understand a lot of different influences on Afghan culture. And this article kind of breaks it down into these 6 points. The first thing is just understanding the history of women's rights movements in Afghanistan and what's kind of led to the situation where we're at today. Understanding the class and economic differences in women in Afghanistan and the influence that that has, this traditional division between public and private life, the influence that displacement and refugee status and even internally displaced people, the impact that that has had on the culture and the outlook of women, this cultural dissonance between the West and what the West wants to fight for as far as women's rights and what Afghan women want to fight for. And then at the very end, they also offer possible solutions moving forward to the aid that could be given to Afghan women. So the beginning of women's emancipation movements in Afghanistan actually goes back to the 1920s. During this time, the King and Queen of Afghanistan had visited Europe and were very influenced by a lot of the things that they saw there. And so when they returned, they launched a bunch of new reforms, some that were not well received by most of the general public. Some of these reforms were apart from women's rights, such as instituting a constitutional monarchy, but a lot of the ones that most people were upset about were ones about emancipation of women. So on their return, there was a complete emancipation of women. There was compulsory education for both males and females, as well as the foundation of co-educational schools. A lot of these reforms were met with with people being just very unhappy at being forced to change traditions that had just existed for so long in Afghanistan. So a lot of these reforms lead to a general uprising from the public and an eventual overthrow of the monarch. So after the 1920s, there's not a major movement towards women's emancipation after the failed attempts in the 1920s. We do see kind of an uptick starting in 1959 when King Shah voluntarily ends female seclusion as well as authorizes the removal of the veil. He does open up girls' schools as well as medical facilities for those who want to become nurses to receive training. And this gives women a lot more options as far as education and careers. However, it's important to note that none of these things were mandatory, none of these things were government enforced, instead it was voluntary. So this gave a lot of the power in the decision making back to the families themselves, which in Afghanistan, with the family at the center of much of the cultural network, this was an important move and was a lot more accepted and got a lot more traction because people were willing to work within the family unit to decide what worked best for them. In 1964, we see the women are given the right to vote. Granted, only a small group of women, and usually those in city areas who were middle to upper class, really could take advantage of these rights. So it's a very, very small group of women that actually are able to do things like vote and go to school and pursue a career. During all this time, we do see that these limited reforms brought a big reaction from religious conservatives. So again, there's still this concern that these changes are going against the teachings of Islam. And we do see like attacks on unveiled women, particularly at universities, at school, sometimes acid being thrown, other forms of attack and punishment becomes more prevalent, especially in city areas from religious extremists and conservatives. So, beginning in 1978, when the Soviet forces invade Afghanistan, we have more reforms that come into place under the communist regime. Again, these ones aren't voluntary, these ones are the ones that are enforced by the communists that have now taken over the country. Some of these reforms that we see are a stopping of the bride price, so it's no longer permitted to pay a price for a bride to a family. We see a raise in the age of marriage to 16. There's also a very aggressive literary program put into place to try to increase literacy among the women and others in the country, as well as increase in both careers and positions that women are able to be involved in. So we see a lot more women that start entering like the medical field, who start becoming teachers, who actually become able to hold places in government and positions in government. A lot of resistance to these communist reforms is coming from the rural areas. So city areas tend to be more embracing of these changes, whereas rural areas are really where the resistance to the communist regime kind of builds up. So we see a lot of pushback. Most of the fighting that we see happening between the Afghanistan resistance and Communist Party is happening in these rural areas. So we see a lot of internally displaced people from these rural areas leaving to places like Pakistan, and even just other places in the country of Afghanistan to be able to get away from fighting. This distrust of the communist regime results in rural areas being very, very focused on education and really associating any kind of education and schoolings with the communist regime. This leads to attacks on schools in rural areas, and often teachers who were women teaching in these schools are killed as well. So from 92 to 96, at this point, communists have been completely pushed out of Afghanistan, and we see that there's this idea among the rural areas where they see cities that were under communist rule as areas of sin, and a lot of that comes back to just the visibility of emancipated women. During the communist regime, a lot of women entered the work field. They were in powers of position or positions of powers in the government and in the hospitals. Most of the teachers were women as well. And so this visibility, this high visibility of women who are unveiled, who are in the workplace, um, leads to this traditional idea that cities are just these centers of sin. Um, and so this conquest and pushing out of communism leads to kind of a return of rural culture. And this starts with the Mahadin government. And this government is the ones that push the communists out. It's also the root of what eventually turns into the Taliban. And so the Mahadid government oppose communist rule directly, and so with their pushback, they were backed by the United States. Now, it's important to remember that a lot of these members of the Mahadin government actually were involved in some of these acid attacks and attacks against women in the universities, but they're backed by the United States. They're able to push out the communists, and as such, they start to impose all of these restrictions that we think of a lot of times when we think of Taliban rule. So women must be veiled in public. Western wear is no longer allowed for women. They have to be in a burqa. Many women become scared to leave their homes because there's just a lot of violence, specifically directed towards women. Um, the rural internally displaced people turns into more urban displaced people as fighting shifts from not the countryside but into the cities. And a lot of women who even could work anymore don't work anymore. And a lot of that is because their families don't want to send them to work, because the areas that they would traditionally work in, such as the government and the hospitals, um, as well as aid agencies, become high targeted areas for attack by the Mahadin government. So that brings us to 96 to 2001. At this point, the Taliban has completely taken control of Afghanistan. There are some good, I guess, outcomes from that. Afghanistan does see an increase in agriculture and crops as these farmlands are kind of restored. We see women contributing in more traditional ways to the family. And in cities, however, we do see more women's rights violations. And a lot of that is just because in the cities, these are areas where women were more free um, in the past before the overtake of the Taliban. So we see women are barred from working. They must be veiled in order to leave the house and with an escort of a male member of the family. We see a lot of women who originally held government positions are dismissed as government employees, and a lot of this is under the guise of needing to cut spending, government spending, but they're dismissed and they lose their jobs. A lot of changes to women's rights happened during this time, and a lot of these include women being forbidden to work in foreign agencies. A lot of time, the NGOs and those offering humanitarian aid would hire women from Afghanistan to work for them, and this is not allowed anymore. Any assistance to widows is only given through family, so that severely limits the amount of resources that a lot of these women have access to. There's a loss of senior positions, so women are no longer, the few that are allowed to work are no longer able to advance their careers. Women are asked to walk calmly with no noise in the streets. They cannot be seen in a vehicle or be in a vehicle with foreigners, and there's extremely harsh punishments for breaking the law. So even with all of the changes that women are facing with different changes to their rights and different rules being imposed, they do find a way to kind of spin things the best that they can. And I absolutely love this quote from Barakat and Wardell. It says, "Amid such assaults on their freedom, Afghan women refused to be cowed and sought their own subtle modes of protest. Imposition of the Shadari on all women," so Shadari is a burqa, "on all women was intended to enforce a measure of standardization and anonymity. However, women are already making their own fashion statements." So the whole idea with the Taliban behind the Shadari or the burqa was to create this kind of cohesive image of women. Everybody looks the same. You can't distinguish any features. It's all the same. And this is the whole idea that the Taliban is really like pushing on women. However, Barakat and Wardell go on to explain that during this time, a lot of women began buying and fashioning these burqas in these just extraordinary array of colors. So we see bright blues and turquoises, we see reds, and even in some areas, greens and bright yellows and oranges become popular. And this was just the women's own way of being able to push back on a lot of the different rules and regulations that were being forced upon them, to really try to take it the best that they could and just turn it in a way that they were back in control. So all of these restrictions being put in place by the Taliban are felt a lot more in urban city areas where there were more freedoms for women during the communist regime. A lot of NGOs and other aid organizations start to pull their support of Afghanistan in general as a form of protest for the different policies that are being put in place by the Taliban. Some of the NGOs find that taking more non-confrontational approaches and trying to just um, build a relationship with the Taliban while still supporting the people, that they have a little bit more bargaining power to be able to hire women and further empower women and give back some of those rights. But overall, there is this large pull of support, which becomes highly criticized by the Taliban and other areas of the country as Afghanistan enters the state of drought. Now, after they've already been in different wars and conflicts over the last several decades, agriculture still hasn't made a big comeback, and then to have a drought on top of it makes food and water just very scarce and just very hard and taxing. At the same time that this drought is happening and there's this pull of support from the NGOs and different aid organizations. There's also this worldwide pull to try to convince the Taliban not to destroy the Bayaman Buddhas. And this big pull of trying to possibly buy the Buddhas from the Taliban and different things to try to preserve this form of history is then kind of turned on its head by the Taliban, who goes back to the people and explains that, oh, the West is much more concerned about trying to save these stone statues than they are about giving aid and help to Afghan children who are starving and who don't have enough water. And they really tried to spin that on its head, that the West is much more concerned about this than they are about helping our people. So after going into just the history of different women's rights movements, Barakat and Wardell kind of dive into more of the cultural standpoints of what freedom for women looks like to the Afghani people. In this first section, after all the history, they talk about how it's really a tale of two worlds in Afghanistan, and how a lot of times in the West we have this idea that before the Taliban, women were afforded all of these different kinds of freedoms, that they had the ability to move freely in the cities and just everywhere in the country, when really this isn't true. There were wide varying degrees of freedom for different groups of women even before the Taliban was in place. And so they talk about how even in urban areas, which tend to be more progressive as far as women's rights, economic status made a big difference on the freedoms that were given to women. They talk about how those that are upper middle class women are able to move more freely. These are the women who study at the university. They are career driven. They pursue careers. They exercise their right to vote. Whereas the poorer women in the city still go outside fully veiled. They don't leave the house without a male escort from the family. There's very little interaction between the sexes, and the women mostly remain at home. So even in the cities, there's this very, very wide divide on acting on the freedoms that women were given before the Taliban. Village life even is very different depending on where you live. So in the mountains, villages tend to be very kin-oriented. So everybody in the village is seen as just one big extended family. And so women have a lot more freedom to move around in the village, to go unveiled, because everybody there is family. Whereas villages in the plains and rural areas are much more diverse. And so instead of having an entire village that is all extended family, we see that different sections of the village are set up very much kin oriented, so different kin oriented wards, so that women can move freely within those wards, but not the village as a whole. And in these rural areas, we see that women aren't just assigned to stay at home, but they have a very prominent role in the agricultural community. They're very much a part of harvesting the crops and helping with everything that goes into agriculture, working hand in hand with their male counterparts. And everything, the males have their assigned tasks and the women have their assigned tasks, but everything comes together to be able to run these farms, to make rugs and different things like that. But at the center of all of this is that motherhood and being a wife is at the very core and the very top priority for these women in these rural areas. So within Afghanistan, we see kind of this division of influence. What we see as the public arena and then private areas such as the household. And the Pruda is this traditional segregation of the sexes. This is not something that the Taliban kind of invented or introduced. It's a cultural tradition in Afghanistan and that's been around for a while. And Barakat and Wardell point out that there's a tendency for outsiders unfamiliar with the nuances and complexities of Afghan culture to focus only on the visible public arena and neglect those private areas such as the household. And for women, it's in these private areas that they are able to impose a lot of their influence. The public arena is very much male dominated, but women's roles in private affect a lot of the outward public appearances of the males in the family. So, for example, women's roles include things like brokering peace, mobilizing war. So, it is the mother's decision whether she will allow her sons to fight or if she asks them not to. That is her given right to exert that power. In Islam, sons also need their mother's forgiveness to enter heaven, and so that's another way that a woman has pull on her family. And this is really where women in Afghanistan hold their power. It's in this private sector, in the private areas within the family. They hold a lot of power and a lot of persuadability. Granted, a lot of changes have come about just because of displacement and refugee life. It has been a hard adjustment for women of all walks of life. Those from rural areas who were used to being able to kind of go freely have a harder time because of the lack of privacy. For educated women, this push and refugee life tends to bring them back to more traditional values. Um, but the slow Traditionally there's a low number of refugee men within these camps, and so women have kind of taken on a lot of the responsibilities that were either shared or completely given to men. So we find that women are more actively participating in decision making. For example, the article mentions that women took over constructing permanent housing rather than tents to give more privacy. And this was something that had never been done by most of these women before. But they were right in the middle of the construction of all of these permanent houses. Um, they hold this role and motivation for war. So deciding whether to send their sons and husbands to fight in keeping them motivated to fight for what they're fighting for. We do see like an increase in birth rate among refugee women, as well as kind of this added responsibility of completely raising their children alone. That means that they're making decisions for their children's education and other things that usually would be consulted with the man of the house, but they take over these roles completely. Women take the forefront in negotiating over resources within the camps, as well as keeping interactions nonviolent when tensions are raised. And that's something that is pointed out in the article that they do a very, very good job of. There's been very, very few instances of violence within these refugee camps because the women are so good at just keeping everybody calm. Um, as far as education women, again, this refugee status brings a return to traditional values. We find that a lot of women are starting to don the veils, especially as they assimilate into Pakistan's values during their time in these refugee camps. A lot of women, this is their first experience with access to healthcare, and there are studies that show that women that respond well to access to healthcare in their refugee lives, they advocate for those rights when they return back home. And a lot more kids are enrolling in primary school, so we see a lot of not just the the boys, but little girls who are enrolling in school and getting an education as well in these camps. So with any kind of conflict and upheaval, we do see a lot of vulnerability pop up among populations. Um, and this is something that's important to take into consideration when we look at the aid that these Afghan women and families need. So Barakat and Wardell do a great job when they say when addressing issues of vulnerability in the Afghan context, it is often neither possible or appropriate to single out Afghan women, since their plight is usually inextricably linked to that of their families. So, since women in Afghanistan view themselves as part of this big nuclear family, and that is how they define their worth and their context, it's important that when we look at coping strategies that we realize that even though some of these strategies are employed by male members of the family, they still affect the women because of this familial unit that the culture is based around. So a lot of the different familial coping strategies that we see include things like finding work with NGOs or other aid agencies. And specifically, this supports extended family. A lot of NGOs are finding that just by hiring one person, they are supporting with their salary groups of 10 to 15 extended family members. We see families and women selling their belongings. We see them make a conscientious effort to group themselves within nuclear family groups and even similar ethnic groups within these refugee camps. Um, we see a lot, unfortunately, of people becoming very aid dependent. Most of the humanitarian aid that is going to Afghanistan isn't going to long-term solutions. It's going just to help people survive. So we see a lot of aid dependence forming as well. We do see younger men joining different warring factions to try to support their family, again, always with the mother's approval. We do see a drop in the age of women getting married, as well as more remarriages of widows, oftentimes becoming second wives to be able to have kind of that family support and that safety net that's found in the family. There is an increase in begging and prostitution. We see an increase in child labor and also an increase in criminal behavior, such as dealing in the opium trade and even smuggling in between countries from the refugees. Insiders and outsiders. So there is this definite division between how the West views Afghanistan women and how they view themselves. And so one of the big things is just this patriarchy overview that a lot of times the West paints in a very negative light. However, we do need to realize that given the familial structure of Afghanistan, that this patriarchy functions as a safety net for women in Afghanistan. It's how they are traditionally taken care of. And so Barakat and Wardell point out that before attempting to undo those aspects of culture that outsiders perceive to be negative, it is important to ensure that alternative strategies are in place for meeting the needs likely to result. A more gradual, cautious, and culturally sensitive approach to effecting social change is needed. So it's not just about trying to embetter women and empower women, but it's also about considering the women in the context of their culture. When humanitarian agencies have tried to separate women from their family context, a lot of the times the resources that they're trying to give out and the ways that they're trying to empower women just don't take because it just does not function and it does not fit into the framework of the Afghan culture. Um, so Barakat and Wardell point out that empowering women through their traditional roles may lead to the deepest changes. This country's most critical needs coincide with the roles traditionally assigned to women, and shouldering these tasks will put women center stage, authentically shaping the future of Afghanistan. So this brings us to the need to work with Afghan women and not for them, which is, I think, a great point to take away from all of this. As Barakat and Wardell point out, inequalities between men and women are likely to continue, and that we need to address these disparities or that when we're addressing these disparities is likely to necessitate a holistic developmental approach focused on the needs of Afghan families, particularly refugees and returnees. So we cannot just focus on Afghan women specifically, but we need to look at the Afghan family as a whole and things that we can do to better women in their ability to fulfill these familial and more traditional roles. And so Barakat and Wardell offer some different interventions that they think can make a big impact, and these include both direct and indirect interventions for women. So some of these include a home-based schooling structure for improving women's education. During the rule of the Taliban, home-based education really took off, and so being able to support women in their ability to teach their kids at home and to help women be able to do that is a great way for improving their kids' education as well as theirs. Um, Different infrastructure projects. That's more of a direct influence on interaction with women, but it does help improve market access and resource access, which is something that falls directly into kind of the women's roles in the family. Also, projects like rural electrification, so bringing electricity into rural areas, again, will help open up a lot of time for women once they have access to those resources. Things like skills training, literacy programs, vocational training, employment. All of these are things that can definitely be offered and can have a big impact, not just on the women, but on their families. The important thing is to remember that these changes cannot be enforced from a Western point of view. So this cannot be something that's mandatory. It needs to be something that is voluntary, that works within the Afghan cultural familial framework. And I just love this quote just to end off with. Afghan women are not passive or powerless victims. They perceive themselves as wielding considerable power, particularly within the family and in brokering peace or mobilization, demobilization for fighting. Women see themselves first and foremost within the framework of the family, and this is reflected in their preferred coping mechanisms in times of hardship. Here's the information from the different references that I used in the course of this PowerPoint, as well as the references for the different images as well. Thanks so much for listening.